This episode is going to be difficult at times. We will be talking about race and racism. We are not experts, and while the role of devil's advocate is often unhelpful, for this episode we do want to look at all sides of what is a controversial topic. We hope that you'll lend us grace as we try to navigate something perhaps out of our depths, but we're going to endeavor to do so with respect and understanding.
Remember the show all about histories, mysteries, and madness. Deep nautical sea madness from outer space, maybe, I think.
Madness. I heard Magnus, and I was like, who's Magnus? I don't know this reference.
St. Magnus of that church in Bavaria we went to.
That must be why I was thinking that.
More on that next episode. But for now, this week takes us deep into the unsettling mind of one of the 20th century's most controversial writers, a man whose descriptions of the indescribable have created one of the most popular worlds to explore long after his death. It's possible that H P Lovecraft is more popular today than ever before, but certainly not always for good reasons. I am joined by Paul Cthulhu Demetronius, the deep-dwelling frog god of the Carolina swamps, and my name, if uttered, would drive a man insane.
Sanity check.
At least that's what I've been told. Paula, what are your opinions on H P Lovecraft before we dive deep into this? Also, do you like that I've added the word deep into the
you did that.
Channel, the thing before? Yeah, I did all that.
It's not just a deep dive. It's a puntastic deep dive. The
Thank
deep
you.
ones, the old ones. Yeah, I have a lot of opinions about H P Lovecraft.
Educated ones? Or just from the gut?
Some are from the gut and some are educated.
They are different, people. Those things are different.
I like to think of myself as a nice mixture of things here. I like to think of myself as a well-rounded opinion haver. But I love, so Matthew knows this, and some of you listening and watching know this, but I do a lot of tabletop role-playing games. Matthew and I work in gaming. And Call of Cthulhu, which is based on the H P Lovecraft universe, cinematic universe.
Mythos.
the mythos is my favorite role-playing game. I love it. I love this like existential, cosmic horror, creepy, gross. I love it. It's great. I have tried to read H P Lovecraft's stories, and I think they are boring AF. His style of writing is so slow and boring. I'm just like, this is not the excitement that, machine gun
when do I
wielding.
get to roll dice?
Yeah, like, I'm sorry, I thought I was a bootlegger with a machine gun. And also, look, H P Lovecraft, I'll say kind of, in some ways, a piece of shit. Just like, maybe that's not magnanimous enough, but...
It isn't. That's foreshadowing, by the way. I also have opinions on Lovecraft.
He had some very prejudiced views, and that's not cool, I guess, I'll say. Those are my thoughts. Those are my casual thoughts. What about you, or do you want to just save that for the episode?
We'll save that for the episode, but I will say that Lovecraft is huge in the world of gaming, board games, video games, and RPGs. That's how I know him. I own a game right there called Unfathomable. I've got Cthulhu, Death May Die. These are all Cthulhu mythos, Cthulhu cinematic universe games. And they're very popular, but recently it's become also incredibly popular to talk very negatively about H P Lovecraft. And I feel as though while some of those criticisms are valid, I feel like others of those criticisms are incredibly short-sighted and trying to make something out of essentially nothing, I feel, which is something Lovecraft would have enjoyed. But let's get into it. I don't want this to be a political conversation, but I do think we can have some interesting conversations as we go on.
Yeah, well, I think It's going to be interesting. And like we said kind of at the start of the episode here, I think we're going to talk about Lovecraft, I'm assuming, his life and his writings, the history of him as a human. But a lot of this, I think, is going to be just a discussion of us figuring out like what we think about him and his work. And I mean, dare I say, we may even tackle big topics like separating the art from the artist. I don't know. I don't know how prepared I am to dive deep into that, but go on a journey with us and we're just going to see what we think. I think this is going to be just a really open exploration kind of episode, is my feeling.
I have also written a script, but, you know, whatever.
Throw it away.
So who was Howard Phillips Lovecraft? He was born August 20th, 1890, to a family that was, by American standards...
You didn't say that year, right?
He was born in August 20th, 18-dickety-dicks. To a family that was, by American standards, almost aristocratic. They had the type of family tree that could be traced back to the founding fathers of New England. His mom, Sarah Suzanne Phillips Lovecraft. Lovecraft, by the way, his real name. First big shocker for me, honestly.
Lovecraft. Like, what? Do you know what the, like, origin of that name is?
I did actually look into it. So the name Lovecraft, a lot of people think it's Hispanic, although it's absolutely not, because it's kind of related to names like Luckcraft or Lucraft, which comes from the place name Leecroft in Staffordshire near me. So it's...
Maybe it just means like of this place and got kind of bastardized.
Yeah, it just means near Leecroft.
Interesting.
But much cooler. He does really come from the upper crust in many ways. His mother can trace her family back to Massachusetts in the 1630s. And his father was a guy called Winfield Scott Lovecraft, who worked as a travelling salesman for a silversmith's. Howard's first taste of madness would come when he was 3 years old. His father had a nervous breakdown in Chicago and was taken to Butler Hospital in Providence. Butler Hospital is to this day a private psychiatric and substance abuse hospital for adolescents, adults, and seniors.
Oh, wow.
Although I imagine it would be a very different type of care that you'd receive in the early 1890s. A place that at that time would most certainly have been considered an insane asylum. It seems he never got to visit his father, who after 5 years died of some type of form of neurosyphilis. For those that don't know, syphilis is a sexually transmitted illness that has plagued the bodies and minds of anyone who is unlucky enough to get it. It causes depression, mania, psychosis, personality change, delirium, and dementia.
It like eats holes in your brain, basically.
It kills you.
It's awful.
So his care was taken on by his mother and his aunts, and a large part his grandfather. That large part being financially.
His grandfather had a great name, too.
Oh my God, the industrialist Whippy Van Buren Phillips.
Whippy Van Buren Phillips.
Whipple, I think.
Whipple Von Buren. It's the most colonial American rich person name I have ever heard in my life. And he's not even colonial anymore.
Where are all the Whipples today?
I think they got...
Who's naming the kid Whipple?
No one, because you would get beat up forever if your name was Whipple now.
I could name a dog Whipple.
You could name a dog Whipple. That is now the only appropriate thing to name Whipple, I think, is a pet.
Whipple? Get over here. It's obvious from an early age that we are dealing with a creative child. He was reading and writing at infant ages, and it's been through tales of Arabian Nights at 5 years old. He has a love of poetry, a huge interest in mythology, a love for writing his own tales and poems as well. I feel as though some of the claims of his youth, to me, seem as though they were just normal things that kids do.
Yeah.
Rewriting tales, coming up with alter egos, even allegedly his Abdul al-Hazred, which was his name in The Tale of Arabian Nights, which would again pop up with Lovecraft's works as the author of the Necronomicon grimoire. How true that is, I don't know. We can't be sure, but it is fun.
It is interesting to think, like, there's a lot of things that we all do as people, right? Just as grown-ups and as kids, that if you don't go on to do anything else noteworthy, forgive me for saying that a lot of people don't do anything noteworthy, but anything where, like, the grander part of society remembers you, right? If you don't go on to do anything where you are like remembered by history, you just were kind of a normal weirdo, right? Because we're all a little bit weird. But if you have gone on to do something where you're remembered, people look back on that and they're like, this was the sign that they were destined to become a great whatever. And you're like, we kind of all... I rewrote stories and pretended like I was other people and made people call me by different names and stuff. And
you had a cute grump face, which you did, which you'll do now for the people of YouTube.
I will not do.
It's so good. As a young lad, his life was normal in many ways, but littered with the eccentricity, perhaps, of advanced intellect. He didn't go to school much, but his family, it seems, believed that his reading more than made up for that. But he did show the early signs of mental health issues himself. Anxiety, depression, terrible nightmares where he'd see ghouls and ghosts and all manner of terrible things. But that's to be contrasted with the fact that he made his own scientific journals. By high school, he was doing the normal thing, making friends and writing letters to scientific publications.
Yeah, the normal thing as a teenager, writing letters to science journals. Yep, we all did that. That was just the Nintendo Power of his day.
Absolutely. It was like trying to find out what the password was to get Big Head Mode in GoldenEye. It's very similar. But science was his first forte with astronomy columns and stuff like that. I'll also say that, to your point earlier, there is a thing that people say is that one day someone will utter your name for the last time and then you're forgotten forever.
Yeah.
And I heard someone's response to that was, it's like, yeah, that's why I'm going to eat the Mona Lisa. If you eat the Mona Lisa, you will be remembered forever. There's just no two ways about it.
That's one way to go about getting immortality.
It's when his grandfather dies that things get dark for a family once wealthy. Something happens with old Whipple's money, leaving his mother and himself...
He whippled it away.
Well, he leaves his mother and himself out in the cold. They move to a small, cramped and beat-up apartment, I believe on the same street he'd grown up in, on Providence, Rhode Island. For a young man and his mother, this was really not ideal. He's described as a hermit at this point. He doesn't go out other than to take long bike rides alone. Oh, geez, you know, he's me. This is the problem. This is the issue. It's me. He has massive bouts of suicidal depression. He doesn't graduate from high school. He doesn't, therefore, get into Brown, where he wanted to go. It's rough. And frankly, it's relatable. He comes out of this only by the art of trolling people in the newspapers.
How does he do that?
There's a bunch of pulp romance novels out there at the time, and Lovecraft hates them.
Oh, I think I know about this.
Most importantly, he hates a guy called Fred Jackson. So he writes a rhyming letter to the Argosy attacking Jackson, which gets a bunch of press. People writing and defending him. And it's his letters back and forth about this that get him noticed by the UAPA, the United Amateur Press Association. Eventually, he will become president of that association. And this probably saved his life. It certainly saved his career. I found this quote from Lovecraft. In 1914, when the kindly hand of amateurdom was first extended to me, I was as close to the state of vegetation as any animal well can be. With the advent of the United, I obtained a renewal to live, a renewed sense of existence as other than a superfluous weight, and found a sphere in which I could feel that my efforts were not wholly futile. For the first time, I could imagine that my clumsy gropings after art were little more than faint cries lost in the unlistening world.
Yeah. He's like, oh, finally. It feels like the things I'm doing matter. Someone sees me. Someone hears me.
Yeah. He begins writing again. Most importantly, he begins writing fiction. Dagon is published in The Vagrant in 1919, and again in Weird Times in 1923, the story of a tortured, morphine-addicted man who, during World War I, finds himself awash on a strange landscape, pushed up from the sea floor. He sees a monolith, strange creatures, and then a horrid monster that forces him to run back to his boat, before he finds himself back in San Francisco, where, had it been a dream? The book turns out to be a suicide note, but ends with a cliffhanger as a grotesque hand at the window appears.
Creepy.
And look, I'll stop here for just a moment because while a lot of his opinions are perhaps terrible, as we will see, his writing, while not appreciated at the time, is cool. It's awesome. It was ahead of its time, groundbreaking and fundamental to science fiction and horror as we know it today, as important as Edgar Allan Poe. And I like it.
I don't want to think it's boring. I want to like it. Every time I try and like read it again and try and like get into it, I think like the relating of it, like you just said like what the story is, and I was like, oh, it sounds so cool and exciting and creepy. Then you read it and it's like 40 pages of scientific diary entries or whatever, and you're like, cool, get to it. But maybe I always want to try it again.
Yeah, and I feel as though I've got sympathy and empathy for him.
Yeah.
I don't want to come off as an apologist for him, but I have sympathy and I have empathy for Lovecraft because I relate to him a lot in many ways.
I think people are very nuanced, layered, three-dimensional people, and there can be good things and bad things about people. Very few people, like, I mean...
No one.
It's tough, like... People are people and we're fallible, and no one is just straight up evil. There are reasons for why people do things they do. And some people do, this is not necessarily about Lovecraft right now, but some people do really, really horrible things. And it doesn't excuse what anyone has done, and I don't want anyone to mistake that. I mean, what I'm saying for like an excuse, but there are reasons for the way people are. And it's not an excuse and it's not an apology, but it is true.
There's also a big distinction to be made between actions and opinions.
Yes.
At some point, your opinions, when they turn into actions, have consequences. I think mere opinions, perhaps, to some extent, it's like, well, if you just keep it to yourself, mate, just keep it to yourself.
Yeah.
I can't agree with you, but you're not hurting anyone in a sense.
Yeah,
maybe.
It's if no one's actively being hurt, then we're all people.
But then again, he's a public figure. He's someone whose opinion is being perhaps relayed in his writings, or perhaps not. There is a lot of nuance to this.
Sure.
Which we'll get into.
And again, I'll say this is, again, not necessarily specifically about Lovecraft, but if I'm not the one actively doing anything to hurt someone, but the words I'm saying and the things I'm putting out into the world motivate other people, justify other people in their hurtful actions, then am I responsible for that? I think
that's a conversation for a different podcast. But I think up until a point, yes and no.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think you have to completely contextualize, and
it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Anyway, history.
It's around this time, 1921, that it's his mum's turn for a mental breakdown and death in Butler Asylum. And this is when he also meets a woman, a Russian Jewish woman named Sonia Haft-Green. There's a lot said that she is 7 years older than him, which I guess was more of a deal at the time. But the big thing is that Lovecraft is, frankly, a racist.
He's an anti-Semite, but he marries her.
He marries a Jewish woman. This was a curveball, to say the least. They meet at an amateur journalism convention on Independence Day 1921 and are married by 1924. His aunts, who helped raise him, were only notified by letter, and Lovecraft moved into her place in Brooklyn. She was a successful hat shop entrepreneur. He was a writer respected by his peers, but not by any sort of audience. He was kind of a writer's writer, but I feel like he was just too ahead of his time for general readers to accept. There's lots of speculation around how Lovecraft wasn't a sexual man. I don't really believe we know enough to say one way or the other. I think it's an easy dig to have at someone.
Also, like, does it matter? Like, one, you can have a valid relationship with someone that has no sex in it at all. That doesn't make your partnership with them invalid if that's like your jam. Like, and also it does not matter. It doesn't matter where or whether or not he was putting his dick anywhere. You know what I'm saying? Like, it doesn't.
The first time he kisses Sonia is meant to be the first kiss he's had since being a child, and he could have been, I think perhaps he was asexual or non-sexual. I imagine all the syphilis in the family didn't really help with that.
I was like, you know what? I'm good. That's okay.
Watching what happens, I can imagine there could be a frigidness to you once you've seen your father die of a sexually transmitted disease.
There could be weird shame stuff going on too. Like, we don't know, and it's not our place to speculate, but there's all kinds of reasons why someone may or may not choose to or desire to engage in those kinds of things.
Financially, things continue to worsen for the hat shop, and that goes under, and Lovecraft gets offered a job editing for the Weird Times, but he doesn't want to move, and Sonia has to spend time in a sanatorium herself, but they grow apart. Sonia takes a job in Cleveland, and Lovecraft moves to Red Hook, a lower economic area of Brooklyn. He continues to write, though the mood of his work seems to change with his own mood, that of loneliness and nostalgia. And while he plans to move back to Providence, his aunts don't want him to bring along Sonia. So they divorce in 1929. So he's back in Rhode Island. He was back to writing Call of Cthulhu, Mountains of Madness. He travelled extensively to ancient sites where he could find them, and he wrote letters, lots and lots of letters. More letters, and this is honest, more letters than probably the next 10 men combined. Work dried up for him, and as the world he was creating grew more and more complex, the suicide of Robert E. Howard, his friend and correspondent, hits him incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Robert E. Howard is another man modern culture owes a great deal to as the, quote, father of sword and sorcery subgenre. Every other RPG we've ever played.
Yeah.
He wrote Conan the Barbarian, among other things. He ignored his own illness, though, Lovecraft did, and died of cancer, something he would call the grip, at only the age of 46 years old. He never had a book published in his life, not really. Not how they were meant to be published. He didn't see the fame that was perhaps owed to him in many ways. And it's only thanks to Arkham House, a publishing company set up to compile his stories, many of which were lost in pulp magazines, and a lot were only ever shared with his friends in his letters. It was Auguste Derleth, Lovecraft's friend, and a hugely successful writer at the time, that spearheaded this. And it's thanks to him and a few others that gave the time for the world to catch up with the weird fiction that Lovecraft was perhaps the greatest master of. And
the creator of, right? Like, was anyone doing, like, cosmic horror before him?
Not really in the way. I think one way I've heard it described was horror just wasn't doing it for people anymore because World War I had happened.
They're like, we've seen real horrors. This stuff is not scary.
So all these old-fashioned, quote-unquote, horror stories just didn't give anyone the heebie-jeebies anymore because they'd all watched their friends' guts explode out of their chest, all this type of stuff. They'd seen the horrors of war, and even if they hadn't been there, they'd heard about the horrors of World War I, the meat grinder. So it was Lovecraft's imagination and brutal, cosmic, mental horror, tentacles and deep-dwelling gods that you have no power over. It was all this that really began to, Doth the Raven isn't doing it for people no more, right? And it was this crazy world that Lovecraft was concocting that got people's imagination. And that's why it's so popular. My thing is with Lovecraft is that, and this isn't an excuse for racism, but I do think it's a understandable reason for it, is that he's a product of his time. And I think that's something that really gets underrepresented.
I want to tweak what you're saying a little bit. I don't think he's a product of his time as much as he's a product of his circumstances.
He's a product of his class.
Yeah, because there are plenty of people at the time of Lovecraft who were not racist, right? Like, not everyone in history was racist.
I think by the standards of today, those would have been very rare, but perhaps you are correct. By the standards of their day, not racist. But I think by the standards of today, I think, I really believe this, holding other people in history by the standards of today is not fair. Because that's not how progressivism works.
My thought is if there were not people who existed in history who did not think more like we did today, progress wouldn't have happened. But maybe I'm taking too much of a wholesale, look, maybe it's progress is more incremental than that. But that's why I feel like saying someone is a product of their time, I just think there were people in that time who did not think that, who were not racist or weren't racist to that degree, didn't act that way, didn't think that way. But I do think we are all products of the context within which we exist. And I think if you're surrounded by people who, like you're saying, he's a product of his class, if his aunts clearly did not like Jewish people. So I think there are reasons for opinions that you might have based on the opinions or interactions that you have in your formative years, right?
Well, I think look at someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a women's rights activist. She was an incredibly important member of the Americans' women's liberation, as it were. But she didn't want liberation for black women. She wanted liberation for white women.
Yeah, there were a lot of people in that movement who...
So my point is that someone who is seen as incredibly progressive for that time still, by today's standards, would be abhorrent, right?
But that's what I'm just saying, but again, not everyone within that movement thought the way she did. Just because a lot of people didn't mean everyone did.
I just don't think it's fair to judge people by today's standards. I don't. Because I don't think it's fair to judge grandma for when she says something racist, because she's a product of her time, and it doesn't excuse it. It's still racist or whatever, but I just don't think it excuses it, but it does explain it.
I think that the trick comes where people are like, well, it's okay that she thinks that or he thinks that because they're a product of their time. Well, it's not okay. It's still not an okay opinion to have, but we understand maybe why they have that opinion. But that doesn't mean that we have to say, yeah, and it was okay that he thought that way because that's just what people thought. It's no, it was wrong that people thought that. But, and it's important for us now to be able to acknowledge that.
I do think Lovecraft's family were racist. His aunts don't want a tradeswoman in the family. And I think you could replace the word tradeswoman with Jew.
Yeah, I think so.
But maybe they were just also incredibly classist. They were from a certain stock and didn't want to water down the family with the working class.
Yeah.
I don't know. That could both be true.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest memes, one of the biggest things that people say of Lovecraft is not to Google the name of his cat, which was named a terrible slur. There's no denying it. And it often gets, he got a cat and named it the N-word, essentially. The thing is that was his family's cat, and they got him when Lovecraft was 9. Did he name the cat? I don't think that's probably true.
He did include the name of that cat as a little in his story, but
yeah,
he didn't think of it as a bad word, right? It was a descriptor word for him. Does that make sense? That feels like a weird thing, I'm trying to justify, but people used words in the past that now we say those aren't okay. We now say this, and oh, I don't know. This is a history
podcast, not a social political podcast. We're just trying to make sense of it.
This is a history podcast. It's not a philosophy podcast. We're exploring thoughts, and I hope again that you will be really open and grant us grace as we kind of publicly explore thoughts.
Well, the other thing is that I think Lovecraft is judged on a snapshot out of his life rather than being judged for the totality of his evolving opinion as he grew older. I think the worst thing anyone could possibly think of me is the people in university still thinking I'm that person.
Sure.
Or the people I used to work with in a bar still thinking I'm that person. I have changed and evolved so much. I don't think I was ever a terrible person, but
no, but we're all different.
I think I've changed, and I've changed so much, right? And I think even who I was last year, I wouldn't want anyone to think of me as who I was last year. One thing I always try to do is, if I haven't seen someone in 2 or 3 years, when I see them again, I try to approach it as though I'm meeting them for the first time.
Yeah.
Because I've certainly had massive transformative periods in my own life. And I think very recently I have, where I'm trying to be just a better person in general, right? And I will say that Lovecraft, his racism, which was certainly evident, he had some negative things to say.
Yeah.
Although I will also say that I do think that I do believe that people, and S.T. Joshi has also said this, who's perhaps one of the most formative Lovecraft. He is the most formative Lovecraft researcher in the world. I think slight apologist at times, but he's certainly the foremost expert on Lovecraft, in my opinion. I think that some people read into his work and they try to take out things and twist them in ways that make them racist. Whereas I also do think that some of the things he said were racist. But I think there's both of those things going on. What I wanted to say was that his racism does seem to have tempered in later life. That is because he was very much a proponent of English people should be as English as possible, and French people should be as French as possible, and Spanish people should be as Spanish as possible. And I think in his formative years, he wasn't, and perhaps into his later life, he wasn't a fan of mixing.
Which you could argue is part of some of the horror described in some of his stories, right? Like, there is like
breeding with the monsters. That was certainly something, and you could argue that comes from a racist place.
Does and it may. Here's the thing: is that something he thinks is scary because of his views about, like, I'll call it like purity of bloodlines? Or, is he consciously going, these people are non-white people and the white people are mixing with them, and so that's this horror story I'm going to write? Or was he subconsciously thinking, ooh, the mixing of these things and intermingling with the unknown, which in his head subconsciously is people who are different from him? Like, was he trying to say that with his work, or did that just seep into his work, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And we don't know.
Perhaps
right?
both. I don't think it's fair to say that he wasn't racist at all and didn't have those opinions, because he certainly did at times.
And if that is the opinion he had, then it would seep in. Like, your worldview is going to seep into anything you do.
The thing is that he spent a lot of his later life traveling, and he would go and he was fascinated by other cultures. And he, like, really respected a lot of these other cultures and was fascinated by them. And I think his racism really did temper as he got older. He went to, like, for the Quebecois people and the First Nation communities. And he grew, if anything, I personally believe that he eventually actively fought against his upbringing to become less racist than the standard of his class at that time. And I think that is the definition of being progressive.
Yeah.
He fought against his racism in his later life, and he died young. So perhaps he could have gone on to be a spokesperson for those progressive views. We don't know, because he died of cancer at 46.
Right.
So I just think that I don't have any skin in the game. I don't need to defend Lovecraft.
Sure.
I don't need to not defend Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Who cares? I've just seen so many people, because of where we kind of like reside in the board game world and stuff, so many people saying so many negative things about him, that I just think it's an easy dig to say something that you think Lovecraft is a terrible person, and everyone pats you on the backs and gives you a round of applause and says, well, you're so progressive and you're such a great person. But I just don't think it's as cut and dry as that. And I think people should do more research on him as a person. And perhaps even while his youth and not all of his youth, I would say up until middle age, he could have been certainly considered a racist, even at the time.
Yes, I think even at the time he was. He did write in letters about his like Germanic bloodline and being proud of that and the purity of that and that being the best bloodline and the, you know, that existed and blah, blah, blah. So those things did exist and it's there in his letters, but he did later write at least some letters saying, hey, I have kind of walked myself back on some of this and I was wrong about some of these things, you know, and we won't know, like you're saying, Matthew, we can't know how that would or wouldn't have continued to evolve for him because he died. But
I can't judge him on the man he could have been.
Right.
We have to judge him on the man he was. But I do see that towards the later end of his life, he was changing. And I really think that shows a strength of character. I do think so.
I think it is possible to enjoy his work and to build on it now and to use it for our creative outlets and our work now while simultaneously acknowledging the bits of it or the bits of him that weren't okay, while also acknowledging the bits that were. Does that make sense? Like, I think it's okay to say, hey, I'm not going to use this particular Lovecraft story in my Call of Cthulhu game or in my horror film or in my whatever, because I think that bit is based on racist views. I don't want to use that. But this idea here is really feels separate from that and is interesting, and it's about like fear of the unknown and this existential dread and this universal experience that we all have. Or maybe we use the exploration of why do we have fear of the other? Why is that the scary thing? And maybe in a safe space, we use that to explore our own fears of people who are different from us and figure out how to work through those fears. It's so complicated and people are nuanced. And what I'll say is I think, and again, this is not about history now. This is more about social issues, I guess. But the way I view Lovecraft is the way I try to view most people, which is if people aren't allowed room for grace and growth and to make mistakes and to actively try to be better, then there's no reason for anyone to actively try to be better. So we can't just throw the whole man away. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. People need to be able to grow. And if we don't allow them the celebration of their good parts so that they can grow those more than their bad parts, then what's the point?
If you're going to be judged on who you were and not who you've become, what's the point of changing into that person?
Matthew, thank you so much for being willing to tackle a really interesting topic that is also potentially fraught with danger. You know, like, this is not an easy topic to dive into, and I'm grateful that we trust each other to be able to have an exploration discussion about our thoughts and feelings surrounding H P Lovecraft. And we are grateful for you, our audience, for listening, and I hope feeling like we've approached it with open minds and respect and honesty and curiosity. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Remember. If you have thoughts, then I don't know, find us on the internet and let us know in graceful, kind, understanding ways, everyone. We're all just doing our best out here. We appreciate you being here, especially for an episode that has a slightly different vibe than some of our episodes. So if you enjoy this, please rate and review it wherever you listen. That helps us in discoverability, which helps us grow, and we would love to grow more as a show.
Leaving a 5-star rating wherever you listen to this podcast does so much more than you could possibly imagine that it does. It just helps the show become more discoverable rather than creeping around in the back rooms of the internet. It really does help.
Creeping around in the deep hoping that the tentacle of Cthulhu may find us and pull us out of the ocean. That's right, I connected it back to the episode. Thank you so much for listening. Share us with a friend if you have one who you think might enjoy what we're doing here. Matthew?
I'm always telling people share me with a friend.
Share me with a friend, y'all. Thank you so much again for your prep and willingness to tackle this episode. And we'll catch y'all all next week.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.